In the bitter winter of 1945, in a small village in eastern France near the German border, a young French schoolteacher named Sophie Moreau made a decision that could have gotten her executed by both sides of the war. She dragged a gravely wounded American soldier into her cellar, concealed him beneath piles of winter vegetables and old furniture, and lied to the German patrol searching her house about the blood trail leading to her door. Lieutenant James Mitchell of the 101st Airborne had been shot down during Operation Varsity, had evaded capture for 3 days in the frozen French countryside, and had collapsed on Sophie's doorstep just as Wehrmacht soldiers began their morning rounds. Sophie should have turned him in. France had been liberated months earlier, but this border region remained contested, and German patrols still searched for Allied soldiers and resistance members. Harboring an American would mean death if discovered. But when Sophie looked at the unconscious paratrooper bleeding on her kitchen floor, when she saw past the enemy uniform to the young man fighting for the liberation of her country, she couldn't bring herself to let him die. What followed was 8 weeks of impossible secrecy, 8 weeks of Sophie nursing James back to health in a cramped basement, while German soldiers occupied the floors above. 8 weeks of two people from opposite sides of the conflict discovering that war's boundaries meant nothing to a heart that refused to see enemies, only human beings. This is their story, the schoolteacher and the paratrooper, falling in love in a basement while the war raged overhead, proving that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do during wartime is choose compassion over survival. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more untold wartime love stories that defied every rule of war. Tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Sophie Moreau was 28 years old in March 1945, living in the small Alsatian village of Rohrbach-les-Biches, caught in the volatile border region between France and Germany. The village had changed hands multiple times during the war, occupied by Germany since 1940, briefly liberated by Allied forces in late 1944, then contested again during Germany's desperate winter counteroffensives. By March 1945, the area was nominally free, but German patrols still operated, and the front lines were close enough that artillery fire was a constant background noise. Sophie had been a schoolteacher before the war, educating village children in French literature and history. The German occupation had transformed her work. She was forced to teach in German, to present curriculum that glorified the Reich, to watch as her students were indoctrinated into Nazi ideology. But Sophie resisted in small ways. She taught the forbidden French authors through coded lessons, maintained her students' connection to their French identity, quietly undermined the propaganda she was forced to present. Her resistance had cost her. In 1943, the Gestapo had arrested her father, a doctor who'd been treating wounded resistance members. He'd been sent to a concentration camp and never returned. Sophie's mother had died shortly after from grief and illness. Sophie was left alone in the family house, teaching children by day, while mourning her parents and carrying quiet rage against the occupation that had destroyed her family. By 1945, as Allied victory became inevitable and Germany's defeat approached, Sophie had learned to survive through careful neutrality. She taught, she kept her head down, she avoided drawing attention from either German patrols or French collaborators seeking to demonstrate loyalty before liberation made collaboration a death sentence. Then, on the morning of March 24, 1945, James Mitchell collapsed on her doorstep. James was 24 years old, a lieutenant with the 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Screaming Eagles who'd jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought through some of the war's most brutal battles. He'd survived the hedgerows, Operation Market Garden, and the Siege of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. By March 1945, James was a combat veteran with more than a year of continuous fighting behind him, someone who'd seen friends die and had killed enemy soldiers, who carried the psychological scars that all combat infantry accumulated. Operation Varsity, launched on March 24, 1945, was the last major airborne operation of the war in Europe. A massive paratrooper and glider assault across the Rhine River to secure bridgeheads for the Allied advance into Germany's industrial heartland. James's company had jumped that morning, dropping into heavy German anti-aircraft fire. James's parachute had been hit by flak, partially collapsed, and he'd landed hard in a forest several miles from his intended drop zone. Disoriented and alone, James had gathered his equipment and tried to reach Allied lines. But he'd stumbled into a German patrol, exchanged fire, and been hit in the shoulder and leg. He'd evaded capture, hidden in the forest for 3 days with minimal supplies, his wounds becoming infected, fever setting in. Finally, desperate and delirious, he'd made his way to the nearest village, hoping to find Allied forces, or at least sympathetic French civilians who might help an American soldier. He'd reached Rohrbach-les-Bitche at dawn, too weak to continue, and had knocked on the first door he could reach, Sophie's door, before collapsing unconscious. Sophie had opened her door to find an American paratrooper, in full combat gear, lying bleeding on her doorstep. Her first instinct was panic. If German patrols found him here, she'd be shot immediately. Her second instinct was the one that defined her. This soldier was fighting to free France, was wounded and dying, and she couldn't turn him away. She dragged James inside. He was barely conscious, mumbling in English, his uniform soaked with blood. Sophie had medical training from helping her doctor father, and she quickly assessed James's wounds. Gunshots to shoulder and thigh, both infected, fever indicating sepsis setting in. He needed a hospital, antibiotics, professional care, but there was no hospital available. The nearest was in German-controlled territory. Moving James would mean his capture and Sophie's execution. Sophie made her decision. She dragged James to the cellar, concealed him beneath stored vegetables and furniture, and began treating his wounds with the limited supplies available. Her father's old medical kit, home remedies, determination to save this American who represented hope that France's nightmare would finally end. She'd just finished hiding James when German soldiers knocked on her door, searching for the paratrooper whose parachute had been seen descending 3 days earlier. Sophie answered calmly, allowed them to search her house, stood by while they examined her kitchen where James's blood still stained the floor. "What's this blood, Fräulein?" the German sergeant demanded. "I butchered a chicken yesterday," Sophie lied smoothly in fluent German. "Made a mess. I haven't cleaned it yet." The sergeant looked skeptical, but moved on. The soldiers searched the house thoroughly, including the cellar, but Sophie had hidden James well. They left, warning her to report any Allied soldiers immediately, threatening consequences if she was caught harboring enemies. When they were gone, Sophie returned to the cellar and began the most dangerous task of her life, keeping an American paratrooper alive in her basement while German soldiers occupied the village. James regained consciousness 3 days later, confused and disoriented. He was lying on a makeshift bed in a dark cellar, his wounds bandaged, fever still present, but reduced. A young French woman was changing his bandages, speaking softly in accented English. "You're safe," Sophie said, when James's eyes focused on her. "You're in my cellar. Germans searched the house but didn't find you. You need to stay absolutely quiet during the day. There are patrols and sound carries." "Where am I?" James managed to ask, his voice weak. "Rohrbach-les-Bitche, about 15 kilometers from where your division dropped. The front lines are close, but not close enough for you to reach safely. You'll stay here until you're well enough to move. Then I'll help you reach Allied forces." "Why are you helping me?" James asked. "You could be shot for this." "Yes," Sophie acknowledged simply. "But you're fighting to liberate my country. How could I not help? Besides, my father would have helped you. He was a doctor who treated wounded resistance fighters. The Gestapo killed him for it. I'm simply continuing his work." Over the following days, as James slowly recovered from his wounds, he and Sophie developed a routine born of necessity and danger. During the day, when German patrols were active, James remained absolutely silent in the cellar, barely moving, making no sound that might alert the soldiers who sometimes quartered in village houses. Sophie conducted her life normally above, teaching school, shopping for scarce supplies, maintaining the appearance of loyal French cooperation with German authority. But at night, when the village slept and patrols were less frequent, Sophie would descend to the cellar. She'd bring James food saved from her own meager rations, would change his bandages, would talk quietly about anything and everything. They couldn't speak loudly. Walls were thin. Neighbors might hear English and report her, so their conversations were whispered intimacies that created unexpected closeness. James told Sophie about growing up in Montana, about the vast open spaces so different from cramped European villages, about enlisting after Pearl Harbor because he believed fascism threatened everything worth preserving. He told her about D-Day, about jumping into darkness over Normandy, about the friends he'd lost in 11 months of continuous combat. Sophie told James about France before the war, about teaching literature to children who'd now spent their formative years under occupation, about her father's courage and death, about living each day with the knowledge that any small mistake could mean execution. She told him about maintaining her students' French identity despite German curriculum, about small acts of resistance that barely mattered but kept her human. And slowly, in those whispered nighttime conversations in a dark cellar while German soldiers slept overhead, James and Sophie fell in love. It was the most impractical, dangerous love imaginable. An American soldier and a French civilian, hidden in a basement, surrounded by enemies, with no future beyond survival. But it was also undeniable. By early April 1945, James's physical wounds had healed enough that he could move without pain, could potentially attempt reaching Allied lines. But his presence in Sophie's cellar had become increasingly dangerous. German patrols were growing more aggressive as the Allied advance accelerated, and the village was filling with retreating German units. Discovery seemed increasingly inevitable. One evening in mid-April, Sophie came to the cellar with urgent news. German soldiers are moving into houses to quarter overnight. They may choose mine. You need to be ready to stay completely silent for hours, possibly days. No movement, no sound. If they find you, we both die. James took her hand, the first time they'd touched beyond medical necessity. Sophie, I won't let them kill you. If I'm discovered, I'll tell them I broke in, that you didn't know I was here. They won't believe that, Sophie said. They'll execute us both, so we simply cannot be discovered. That night, German soldiers did requisition Sophie's house. 4 Wehrmacht troops took over the main floor, sleeping in her living room and kitchen, staying for 3 days while their unit regrouped before withdrawal. For 72 hours, James remained absolutely motionless in the cellar, barely breathing, while German soldiers walked directly above his head, their conversations and movements audible through the floorboards. Sophie maintained perfect composure, serving the soldiers coffee, answering their questions politely, never betraying that an American paratrooper was hidden meters below their feet. The strain was unbearable. Every creak of the cellar floor, every small sound, threatened disaster. But Sophie's performance was flawless, and when the soldiers finally departed, neither she nor James had been discovered. After they left, Sophie descended to find James conscious but emotionally shattered. I can't do this to you anymore, he said as she entered the cellar. I can't ask you to keep risking your life. Sophie, I need to try reaching Allied lines. The danger to you is too great. You're not asking, Sophie said firmly. I'm choosing. James, these past weeks, hiding you, talking with you, getting to know you, it's reminded me that I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm actually living again, for the first time since my father died. I feel like my life has purpose beyond just enduring until the war ends. Sophie, James said carefully, When this is over, assuming we both survive, what happens? I'll go back to America. You'll rebuild your life here in France. We're from different worlds, and this situation, hiding in a cellar, it's not real life. What we feel might not survive normal circumstances. Sophie met his eyes in the dim cellar light. Maybe not, but I'd rather have these weeks with you, uncertain future and all, than never have known you. I'd rather risk my life for someone who matters than play it safe and live empty. James pulled her close, kissed her for the first time, and they held each other in the darkness. Two people from opposite sides of the war who'd found something worth more than survival. The crisis came on April 25, 1945. A French collaborator who'd been watching, Sophie with suspicion, jealous of her relative's safety, resentful of her education and position, reported to German authorities that he'd heard English being spoken from Sophie's cellar late at night. German military police arrived at dawn, surrounding the house before Sophie could warn James. They arrested her immediately, dragged her outside, and began searching the house systematically. Sophie maintained that she lived alone, that the collaborator was lying out of personal animosity. But the Germans were thorough. They would find James eventually. James, hearing the commotion above, made a decision. He wouldn't let Sophie die for him. He emerged from the cellar on his own, hands raised, uniform torn but recognizable. American paratrooper voluntarily surrendering to save the woman who'd hidden him. The German soldiers immediately took James prisoner. But his surrender complicated things. He'd been hiding in Sophie's cellar for weeks. That was indisputable. But had Sophie been harboring him willingly, or had he forced her cooperation through threats? James insisted loudly in his limited German that he'd broken into Sophie's cellar without her knowledge, had threatened her family if she reported him, had forced her to provide food under duress. Sophie, understanding what James was attempting, played along. "He said he'd burn my house if I told anyone," she claimed in German. "I was terrified. I did what he demanded to survive." The German officer in charge was skeptical but also pragmatic. Germany was losing the war. Everyone knew it. And executing French civilians for ambiguous offenses would create problems with the approaching Allied forces. The officer decided to take James prisoner but release Sophie with a warning. As they led James away, he looked back at Sophie one final time. Their eyes met, and in that glance was everything they couldn't say aloud. Gratitude, love, hope they'd meet again, fear they wouldn't. Sophie watched James disappear into German custody, not knowing if she'd ever see him again, carrying the memory of 8 weeks in a cellar where love had flourished, despite every reason it shouldn't. James was transported to a German POW camp, processed as a captured American paratrooper. Under interrogation, he maintained his story. He'd forced Sophie's cooperation through threats. She was innocent. The Germans, now focused on surviving defeat rather than prosecuting French civilians, accepted the explanation. James spent the final 2 weeks of the war in the camp, watching as German resistance collapsed and Allied forces swept forward. On May 7, 1945, American forces liberated the POW camp. James was finally, officially free after 8 weeks of hiding and 2 weeks of captivity. His first action upon liberation was requesting permission to return to Rohrbach-les-Biches. The army granted him brief leave before returning to his unit. James traveled back to Sophie's village, hoping she'd survived, hoping she still wanted to see the American she'd risked everything to save. He arrived to find the village celebrating liberation. French flags flying, German occupation ended at last. He found Sophie's house, knocked on the door that he'd collapsed against nearly 2 months earlier. Sophie opened it, saw James standing there in clean American uniform, and threw her arms around him without a word. They held each other in her doorway, while the village celebrated around them. Two people who'd survived impossible odds, reunited at last. "I thought I'd lost you," Sophie said finally. When they took you away, I thought they'd kill you, or I'd never find you again. I promised I'd come back, James said. I kept promises I make to women who save my life and steal my heart. What happens now? Sophie asked the question they'd both been avoiding. Now we figure it out, James said. I'll be discharged eventually, maybe a few months. You'll rebuild your school, your life here. But Sophie, I meant what I said in that cellar. I love you. I want a future with you. If you'll have me. If you'll take a chance on a Montana boy who knows nothing about France, except that it produced the most courageous woman I've ever met. Yes, Sophie said simply. We'll figure out the details, but yes. You came into my life bleeding and desperate, and somehow you reminded me what it means to hope. I'm not letting that go. James returned to America in September 1945, was honorably discharged from the Army, and immediately began arranging Sophie's immigration to the United States. The process was complicated. War-torn Europe made paperwork difficult, American immigration quotas were tight, but James was persistent. By March 1946, exactly 1 year after he'd collapsed on her doorstep, Sophie arrived in Montana. They married immediately, settling in James's hometown, building a life that bridged their two cultures. Sophie taught French at the local high school, introducing Montana students to the language and culture of the country that had sheltered her American soldier. James worked as a forest ranger, finding peace in Montana's vast spaces after years of combat. They had 3 children, built a quiet life far from the cellar where they'd fallen in love, proved that relationships forged in extreme circumstances could survive normality. They never forgot those 8 weeks, the danger, the whispered conversations, the love that developed despite every reason it shouldn't. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1996, their children asked how they'd known, after just 8 weeks in such extreme circumstances, that they should be together. Sophie answered, "Those 8 weeks were more real than years of normal courtship. We saw each other at our most vulnerable, most terrified, most authentic. James trusted me with his life. I trusted him with mine. Everything that came after was built on that foundation." James added, "War strips away everything false. In that cellar, we couldn't pretend, couldn't play games, couldn't be anything except exactly who we were, and who we were fit together perfectly. The circumstances were terrible, but they revealed truth that might have taken years to discover in peacetime." James Mitchell died in 2003 at age 82. Sophie lived another 12 years, dying in 2015 at 98. Their children found among Sophie's effects a journal she'd kept during the war, including entries from those 8 weeks James had been hidden in her cellar. One entry stood out, written on the night James had first kissed her. "Tonight the American kissed me in my cellar, while German soldiers slept overhead. It's madness. I'm risking my life for an enemy soldier, falling in love with someone who should be nothing more than a medical patient I'm treating out of patriotic duty. But he's not the enemy. He's James, who fights to liberate my country, who's gentle and kind despite months of combat, who makes me feel alive again after years of just surviving. I don't know what happens next. He might be discovered tomorrow and we'll both be shot. But I'd rather have these few weeks with him, dangerous as they are, than play it safe and never know what it feels like to be this fully, terrifyingly alive." The story of Sophie Moreau and James Mitchell represents a particular type of wartime love, forbidden not because they were technically enemies, but because the circumstances made their relationship potentially fatal to both. Sophie risked execution every day for 8 weeks to protect an American soldier. James surrendered his freedom to protect Sophie from consequences of her compassion. Their love story began in a cellar, conducted in whispers, surrounded by dangers that made every conversation potentially their last. But it lasted 58 years, produced 3 children and 7 grandchildren, proved that sometimes the relationships born in the most extreme Circumstances are the ones that endure forever. She hid him in her basement. A forbidden love between a French schoolteacher and an American paratrooper. Between a woman choosing compassion over survival and a soldier recognizing that the person saving him was worth any risk. It was dangerous, impractical, and by all conventional measures doomed to fail. But it didn't fail. It flourished, first in a cellar during the war's final weeks, then in Montana for more than half a century, a testament to the truth that love doesn't recognize enemies or boundaries or impossible circumstances. It recognizes only human connection, and sometimes that's enough to survive even war. But this wasn't the only time ordinary civilians risked everything to save enemy soldiers. In our next story, you'll meet Maria Schultz, a German farm wife who hid 3 wounded American airmen in her barn during the war's final months. Not because she opposed the Nazi regime, which she quietly did, but because she'd lost 2 sons to the war and couldn't bear to let more young men die when she had the power to save them, even if they were officially her country's enemies.